Napoleon the Great, by Andrew Roberts. Introduction. Have you ever felt like an outsider? A young man, a boy really, stands on a drizzly Parisian street. He's thin, almost gaunt, with an accent so thick his comrades mock him. He's from a small, provincial island, a backwater. He has no money, no connections, no powerful friends. He's a foreigner in a land that looks down on him. By all accounts, his story should have ended there, a footnote in some forgotten military roster. But this young man was different. Within a few short years, this same outsider would command armies with a genius not seen since Julius Caesar. He would stride into the halls of power, topple a corrupt government, and crown himself emperor. He would rewrite the laws of nations, redraw the map of Europe, and hold the fate of a continent in his hands. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. It's a story that seems almost impossible, doesn't it? How does a man rise so far, so fast? What is the secret to that kind of power, that kind of ambition? Today, we are going to journey into the heart of that question, guided by one of the most masterful biographies ever written, Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts. This isn't just another history book. It's a publishing phenomenon, a global bestseller that has redefined how we see this colossal figure. The author, Andrew Roberts, didn't just sit in a dusty library. He walked the ground of 53 of Napoleon's 60 battlefields. He journeyed to the remote island of St. Helena where Napoleon spent his final days. He sifted through over 33,000 of Napoleon's personal letters, many never seen before, to get inside the mind of the man himself. And what he found was not the one-dimensional tyrant of myth, but a figure of dazzling complexity, a brilliant military strategist, yes, but also a visionary lawgiver, a patron of the arts, a tireless administrator, a loving if difficult family man, and a leader who inspired a fanatical devotion in his followers. By the end of this journey, you will understand not only how Napoleon conquered Europe, but the principles of power, leadership, and ambition that he mastered. You will learn the secret of his star, that unshakable belief in his own destiny that carried him through triumphs and disasters alike. And you will see why, 200 years after his death, his story continues to fascinate, inspire, and warn us. So, let's begin. Let's trace the path of that young, unknown Corsican, and discover how he became Napoleon the Great. Book summary. Our story begins not with a clash of cannons, but in the quiet ambition of a boy on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte, as he signed himself until he was a man, was born in Ajaccio on August 15, 1769. His family were what he later called petits gentilshommes, minor nobility with more pride than money. His father, Carlo, was a handsome, charming lawyer, but also a spendthrift who left the family with significant debts. His mother, Letizia, was a strong, severe woman whom Napoleon would later credit for his entire fortune. Here was the head of a man on the body of a woman, he once said of her, the highest of compliments from him. Napoleon was a solitary child, a troublemaker nicknamed Rabouillone, who preferred the company of books to the games of other children. In a small room on the third floor of the Casa Bonaparte, he devoured the lives of the great men of history, Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar. He read Plutarch, and in its pages, he saw a reflection of his own destiny. He felt, even as a boy, that he was capable of achieving as much as these titans of antiquity. This was the first forge of his ambition. He wasn't just reading for pleasure, he was studying the craft of greatness. He learned that history was not made by abstract forces, but by men of will, men who could bend the world to their vision. He even read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's 800-page novel La Nouvelle Héloïse at the age of 9, a book he said turned my head. At the age of 9, he was sent away to military school in France, a land he considered a foreign country, to learn French. He mastered it in only 3 months. From there, he went to the Royal Military School of Brienne, where the proud Corsican boy became a true outsider. He was teased for his thick accent, his Italian name, his poverty, and his oversized head on a thin frame. His classmates nicknamed him La Payonnaise, or Straw Up the Nose, because it rhymed with Napoleone and Corsican. But this isolation didn't break him. It hardened him. It fueled a fierce Corsican nationalism and a burning desire to prove himself. He retreated further into his books, mastering mathematics, geography, and the art of war. To be a good general, he later said, you must know mathematics. He was preparing for a game that no one else knew he was playing. The school's curriculum was steeped in the great man view of history, presenting the heroes of the ancient world for the boys to emulate. For Napoleon, this wasn't just a lesson, it was a career path. This period was also marked by a fierce, almost violent patriotism for his homeland. He wrote essays celebrating Corsica's struggle for independence and even a revenge fantasy story called New Corsica, where an old man recounts finding his mother raped and his family hung by French invaders before he slaughters every Frenchman on a ship, including the cabin boy. It was a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a young man who felt his homeland had been subjugated. His loyalties were deeply divided. He was an officer in the French army, yet his heart was with the Corsican patriot Pasquale Paoli, a man he idolized. Then, in 1789, the world changed. The French Revolution erupted. For a young, ambitious officer without connections, this was the moment. The old rules were being torn up. Birth and privilege no longer mattered as much as talent and audacity. While many of his fellow aristocratic officers fled France, Napoleon embraced the revolution. He saw it not as chaos, but as opportunity. The path to power was now open. His first real test came not in a grand battle, but in the chaotic port of Toulon in 1793. The city had rebelled against the revolutionary government and was occupied by British and Spanish forces. The French siege was failing, run by incompetent generals. A young, unknown artillery captain named Bonaparte was given command of the artillery, largely thanks to the support of a fellow Corsican, Solisti, who was a political commissioner with the army. Napoleon was only 24. Immediately, he radiated an energy that astounded everyone. He found an army with no plan of attack. He requisitioned guns, organized supplies from surrounding towns, established an arsenal to make cannonballs, and designed a brilliant plan. He saw what the older generals had missed, that the key to the city was not a frontal assault, but the capture of a single promontory, L'Aiguillette, which overlooked the harbor. From there, his guns could rain heated cannonballs onto the British fleet. He was tireless, often sleeping on the ground wrapped in his cloak, never leaving his batteries. He showed immense personal courage, at one point picking up a blood-soaked ramrod from a dead gunner to help load a cannon, an act he believed gave him the scabies that plagued him for years. He was even wounded in the thigh by an English bayonet. His plan worked perfectly. The British fleet was forced to evacuate, and Toulon fell. For his pivotal role, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. He was no longer an unknown. This was the blueprint for his future success: meticulous planning, an eye for the decisive point, boundless energy, and personal bravery. But it was in Italy, in 1796, that the legend of Napoleon was truly born. Appointed commander of the Army of Italy, he arrived to find an army in rags. The soldiers were starving, shoeless, and on the verge of mutiny. They hadn't been paid in months, and some battalions had no bayonets. They were facing a combined Austrian and Piedmontese force twice their size. The older, more experienced generals under his command, men like André Massena and Pierre Augereau, were skeptical of this young political appointee who, they sneered, had won his reputation in a street riot. But from the moment he arrived, he electrified them. Massena recalled, he donned his general's cap and seemed to grow by 2 feet. He announced that they would march on the enemy to give battle. What followed was one of the most astonishing campaigns in military history. In less than a year, Napoleon defeated 6 different Austrian armies. He used a strategy of lightning speed, what he called activité, vitesse. He kept his forces divided to march faster, but concentrated them at the decisive moment to fight. He would strike at the hinge point between 2 enemy armies, defeating one before turning to crush the other. This was the strategy of the central position, and he was its master. At the Battle of Lodi, his men stormed a heavily defended bridge, an act of such bravery that they gave him the nickname Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a term of endearment and respect that stuck with him for life. It was after Lodi, Napoleon later said, that the first spark of high ambition was born. He no longer saw himself as a mere general, but as a man who could shape the destiny of nations. He sent millions in captured treasures back to the struggling government in Paris, but he also sent works of art by Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, believing that all the beauty of Italy should belong to France. He was not just a conqueror, he was a collector of civilizations. While his fame grew, his personal life was in turmoil. He had married Josephine de Beauharnais, a beautiful and charming Creole widow 6 years his senior, just before leaving for Italy. He was deeply, passionately in love with her. His letters from the campaign are a torrent of emotion, a mix of poetic adoration and desperate longing. "I have not passed a day without loving you," he wrote. "I have not passed a night without clasping you in my arms. A kiss on your heart, and one much lower down, much lower." But Josephine did not return his passion. While he was conquering Italy, she was in Paris, enjoying the social life and carrying on an affair with a dashing young hussar officer named Hippolyte Charles. The news, when it eventually reached him, was devastating. It was a betrayal that would leave a deep scar. After his triumphs in Italy, Napoleon sought an even greater stage, Egypt. He dreamed of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, of creating an Eastern empire that could threaten Britain's trade with India. The expedition, which set sail in 1798, was more than just a military venture. He took with him 167 of France's greatest scholars, scientists, and artists, the savants, to study and catalogue the wonders of ancient Egypt. This fusion of conquest and enlightenment was uniquely Napoleonic. The campaign began with a stunning victory at the Battle of the Pyramids, where his disciplined squares of infantry shattered the charges of the famed Mamluk cavalry. It was here he delivered one of his most famous lines, "Soldiers, from the top of those pyramids, 40 centuries are contemplating you." But the Egyptian adventure soon turned sour. At the Battle of the Nile, Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at Aboukir Bay, cutting Napoleon off from France. The army was ravaged by plague. An invasion of Syria ended in a bloody failure at the Siege of Acre, a defeat that thwarted any dream of marching to India. Yet, even in this crucible, Napoleon's ability to inspire was unmatched. He famously visited the plague-stricken soldiers in Jaffa, touching them to show he was not afraid, a scene immortalized in a famous painting by Gros. In 1799, with his army stranded and news from France of political chaos and military defeats, Napoleon made a fateful decision. He abandoned his army in Egypt and sailed back to France, evading the British blockade. He returned to a hero's welcome. The people were tired of the corrupt and incompetent Directory government. They saw in Napoleon the strong leader who could restore order and glory. With the help of his brother Lucien and other conspirators like Talleyrand and Fouché, he launched a coup d'état on 18 Brumaire November 9, 1799. It was a clumsy, almost farcical affair. At one point, Napoleon, unused to parliamentary politics, was manhandled by furious deputies in the legislative chamber and had to be rescued by his grenadiers. But it succeeded. The Directory was overthrown, and Napoleon was named first consul. At the age of 30, he was the master of France. "We have done with the romance of the Revolution," he declared. "We must now begin its history." As first consul, Napoleon unleashed a torrent of energy that reshaped France. He worked tirelessly, often 18 hours a day, attending meetings of his new advisory body, the Conseil d'État, where he astonished seasoned administrators with his quick grasp of complex subjects and his relentless questioning. His greatest achievement was the Napoleonic Code, a single unified body of law that enshrined the revolutionary principles of equality before the law, property rights, and religious toleration. It was so clear and so revolutionary that it was adopted across Europe and remains the basis of law in many countries to this day. He reformed the finances, creating the Bank of France, which stabilized the currency after years of hyperinflation. He centralized the administration, creating the system of prefects that still governs France. He established the lycée system of state secondary schools to train a new elite based on merit, not birth. He healed the rift with the Catholic Church by signing the Concordat with the Pope, a move deeply unpopular with his anti-clerical generals but celebrated by the majority of the French people. He was, as one historian put it, the Enlightenment on horseback. But peace was elusive. In 1800, he led his army across the Alps, in a daring repeat of Hannibal's feat, to defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. It was a victory won from the jaws of defeat, saved at the last moment by the arrival of his friend General Dizay, who was killed in the process. This victory secured his power. The period was also marked by constant threats to his life. Royalists, backed by British gold, plotted his assassination. The most famous attempt was the Machine Infernale, a massive bomb hidden in a cart that exploded just moments after his carriage passed on Christmas Eve, 1800, killing 5 people and injuring 26. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, used the outrage to deport 130 of his Jacobin opponents, even though he knew the royalists were responsible. "Chouannerie and the émigrés are skin diseases," he said. "Terrorism is an internal malady." His most ruthless act came in 1804 with the execution of the Duc d'Enghien, a Bourbon prince living just across the border in Germany. Falsely believing the Duke was involved in a plot, Napoleon had him kidnapped, subjected to a sham court-martial, and shot in the moat of the Château de Vincennes. "It was worse than a crime. It was a blunder," became the famous verdict. The act stained his reputation across Europe. Believing that only a hereditary monarchy could secure the future of his reforms and end the cycle of assassination plots, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in a magnificent ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2, 1804. In a moment of supreme symbolism, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head, signaling that his power came not from God, but from himself. His military masterpiece came 1 year to the day after his coronation, on December 2, 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz. Facing a larger combined Russian and Austrian army, led by Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis I, he executed a perfect trap. He deliberately weakened his right flank to lure the Allies into attacking, tempting them to abandon the strategic Pratzen Heights in the center of the battlefield. Then, as the sun of Austerlitz burned through the morning mist, he launched a devastating assault on the weakened enemy center, splitting their army in two and winning his most brilliant victory. For the next few years, he was the undisputed master of Europe. He crushed the famed Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, entering Berlin in triumph. He defeated the Russians again at Friedland in 1807, forcing Tsar Alexander to the negotiating table. At their famous meeting on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit, the two emperors embraced and effectively divided Europe between them. Napoleon imposed the continental system, a Europe-wide blockade designed to cripple his most stubborn enemy, Great Britain. He created a vast empire of satellite kingdoms, placing his brothers and marshals on the thrones of Naples, Spain, Holland, and Westphalia. But the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. His attempt to force Spain into his system in 1808 led to a brutal, draining guerrilla war that he called his Spanish Ulcer, a conflict that would tie down hundreds of thousands of his best troops. His love of family, which seemed so strong, led him to place his often incompetent and disloyal siblings in positions of power, causing endless problems. And his unshakable belief in his own star began to shade into a dangerous overconfidence. The turning point came in 1812, with the invasion of Russia. To punish Tsar Alexander for withdrawing from the continental system, Napoleon assembled the largest European army ever seen, the Grande Army of over 600,000 men from 20 nations. But the Russians refused to give him the decisive battle he craved. They simply retreated, burning their own villages and crops, drawing him deeper and deeper into the vastness of Russia. He defeated them at the horrific Battle of Borodino, the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, but it was not the knockout blow he needed. He entered Moscow, only to find it deserted and then set ablaze by the Russians themselves. "What a tremendous spectacle!" he exclaimed as he watched the flames. "What extraordinary resolution! What men! These are indeed Scythians." Trapped in a burning city with winter approaching and no peace offer from the Tsar, he was forced to retreat. The retreat from Moscow is one of the most terrible episodes in history. The Grande Army was destroyed, not by the Russian army, but by starvation, typhus, and the brutal Russian winter. The temperature plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Men froze to death in their sleep. They were hunted by Cossacks. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers fought over scraps of horse flesh and were even driven to cannibalism. Of the 600,000 who had invaded, fewer than 100,000 made it out of Russia. The spell of his invincibility was broken. The nations of Europe, funded by British gold, rose up against him in the Sixth Coalition. In 1813, he was defeated at the massive Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, a 3-day struggle involving 500,000 men. In 1814, despite a brilliant defensive campaign fought on French soil where he won 4 battles in 5 days, his marshals, weary of endless war, forced him to abdicate. He was exiled to the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean, but his story was not over. In March 1815, in one of history's greatest gambles, he escaped, landed in France with 1,000 men, and began his final march on power. The soldiers sent to arrest him, many of them veterans of his great victories, instead flocked to his banner. At Laffrey, facing a royalist battalion with their muskets aimed at him, he opened his coat and declared, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers broke ranks and cheered, "Vive l'Empereur!" He marched to Paris without a shot being fired, and for a period known as the 100 Days, he was emperor once more. But the powers of Europe would not tolerate his return. At the Battle of Waterloo, on June 18, 1815, he was finally decisively defeated by the combined armies of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian General Blücher. It was a battle of unforced errors, a day when his old genius seemed to desert him. He delayed his attack, failed to coordinate his forces, and hesitated to commit his elite Imperial Guard at the crucial moment. This time, there would be no second chances. He was exiled to the remote, windswept rock of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There, a prisoner of the British, he spent the last 6 years of his life, dictating his memoirs, fighting a petty war with his jailer, the humorless Hudson Lowe, and constructing the legend that would outlive him. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, probably of stomach cancer, the same illness that had killed his father. His last words were France. Army. Head of the Army. Josephine. Commentary. So, we come to the end of this incredible story. And we're left with the question we started with. Was he great? Andrew Roberts' answer is a resounding yes. But what does that greatness consist of? It wasn't just in his 60 battles, though his military genius is undeniable. It was in his capacity to create. Think about it. Before Napoleon, France was in chaos. The revolution had descended into the terror. The government was bankrupt, and the nation was a patchwork of conflicting laws and customs. Napoleon took that chaos and forged a modern state. The institutions he created, the Bank of France, the administrative system of prefects, the lycées, and above all, the civil code, are the bedrock of modern France. He was a whirlwind of energy, a man who, as Roberts shows, could dictate detailed orders for a military campaign, design a new legal system, and argue about the merits of a tragic play, all in the same day. He was, in the truest sense, the Enlightenment on horseback. But his greatness also lies in the sheer scale of his ambition, and the story he tells us about the power of the human will. Here was a man who, by force of his intellect and personality, rose from nothing to master a continent. He taught a generation of ordinary people that they could make history. A soldier in his army was not just a peasant in uniform. He was part of an epic, an adventure that would be spoken of for centuries. He taught ordinary people that they could make history, as one historian put it. Of course, there's a dark side. His ambition came at a terrible cost. The Napoleonic Wars engulfed Europe for over a decade and led to the deaths of millions. He could be ruthless, as the massacre at Jaffa attests, and his ego could lead him into disastrous errors, like the invasions of Spain and Russia. He was no democrat. He believed in order, authority, and power, and he was a master of propaganda, a man who, in his own words, knew that imagination rules the world. So, what can we, and especially a young person on the cusp of their own life's journey, learn from Napoleon? First, the lesson of preparation. Napoleon won his battles long before the first shot was fired. He won them in the lonely hours spent reading in his youth, in his meticulous study of maps, in his obsessive attention to detail. Whatever your field, whatever your ambition, master your craft. Know your subject better than anyone else. That is the foundation of all great achievement. Second, the power of audacity. Napoleon's greatest victories were acts of daring. Crossing the Alps to surprise the Austrians, striking at the enemy's center at Austerlitz when everyone expected a defensive battle, these were calculated risks that others deemed impossible. Don't be afraid to challenge conventional wisdom. See the opportunity that others miss. As Napoleon himself said, "The fate of a battle is the result of a single instant, a thought. Be ready for that instant." And finally, the importance of resilience. Napoleon's life was a series of dizzying highs and devastating lows. He faced defeat, betrayal, and exile. But he never truly gave up. Even on St. Helena, he was fighting his last campaign, the battle for his own legacy. Your own path will have its setbacks. You will face failure. The measure of your character will not be whether you fall, but how you rise. That was the book summary of Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts. We've touched on the great peaks and deep valleys of his life today, but a summary can only ever be a map of a vast and fascinating country. The real journey happens when you explore it for yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase from the book connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is a doorway, an invitation to decide if this epic story is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just learning about history. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you think about ambition, leadership, and the limits of what one person can achieve. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if this journey into the mind of a master has been valuable to you, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's continue to learn and grow together, one great story at a time.